This is CD 1 and contains the first half of Disciple 1, Lesson 18.
The four Gospels, if you read the four Gospels in a stereo scenario, as I call it, you'll readily see that they differ. Not necessarily contradictory, but complementary. An analogy I often use is kind of a crude analogy, but if you go out here on South Boulevard and there's a wreck, a bump up, and you've got four different people stationed at four different places who were eyewitnesses of that event, and if you interview them, all four will probably give you a common denominator of what happened. But then in addition to that, each one will probably give you something that he or she saw that the others didn't see because of their unique angle. Now that to me sort of is an analogy which helps us to understand the four Gospels and why they can all give us the same basic, and the theological word is kerygma. The kerygma is the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That is the kernel. That's the common denominator that they all give to us, and at great length. For instance, John's Gospel, the first 12 chapters covers at least 33 years. Chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 cover 4 days. Now just that alone tells you something about the purpose of why John wrote what he wrote. Here's a few miracles and here's a few teachings, but now let's really settle down to the main reason we wrote. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all center in on and give a great deal of time to the material of the kerygma. In addition to that, then, Matthew gives things that Mark and Luke do not. Luke gives us stories that Mark and Matthew do not. John gives us a whole other viewpoint, as we will spend 2 weeks on John. So thank God for the four Gospels. We don't have just one, we have four. Put them together in a stereo scenario and it gives us, again, not a full biography. They do not purport to be biographies. A biography would be something which would basically be exhaustive and tell you everything that happened. John says at the end of his Gospel, if everything were recorded that Jesus said and did, all the libraries of the world couldn't hold books. But these are written for this purpose, that you might believe that he is the Son of God, and by believing you might have life in his name. So there's a selectivity and there's a purpose to each of these Gospels. Now, we've been studying for 17 weeks the Old Testament, which records to us the implementation and the development of this promise and this covenant. Now, test time. Where in the Old Testament did the promise begin? I heard it. Genesis 3:15. Okay, the promise. A little bit later on, chapter 15, we have the covenant that God made with the world in that strange way back there with Abraham. And so we've been tracing the development of this promise and this covenant. And so those Old Testament scriptures, those 39 books, as early as 180 BC, we can go back and look, and we have evidence as early as 180 BC that those books were considered to be divine and inspired. Well, if the books that record the promise are inspired, wouldn't you think that the events that fulfilled the promise and the recording of those events, wouldn't you think that those books would be seen as equally inspired? That's what happened. So very, very early on then, into the New Testament era, the books of the New Testament came to be seen as being inspired because they chronicled the fulfillment of the promise that these other books in the Old Testament had been talking about for millennia. It was a man by the name of Melito, M-E-L-I-T-O, Melito of Sardis, in 170 A.D. He's the first man who used the term Old Covenant and New Covenant. So what we have then in the New Testament is the recording of the events that the Old Testament long foretold, and then the interpretation of those events and what they mean for our lives and where we go from here. Now, let me show you something. In the Old Testament, you remember there are 3 sections to the Old Testament. There are your historical books, the first 5 books of the Old Testament called the Torah, which supposedly chronologically, sequentially lays out for us how God was in the process of developing a people and a constitution, and of course later on leading them to the land. Then we have that section that's not in any chronological order called the prophets. All the prophets together. And by the way, Joshua is in that second section of prophets. Isn't that kind of interesting, isn't it? So from Joshua then all the way through Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah and all those prophets are sort of lumped. And then beginning with the books of Psalms, we have clumped together a group of what is simply called writings. Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Daniel, etc. So just as there are 3 sections to the Old Testament, there are 3 sections to the New Testament. We could say, the historical books. Those books, I would say, are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the book of Acts. So say Matthew through Acts would be considered the historical section, which would correspond with the historical section of the Old Testament, namely the Torah. Then, beginning with the book of Romans, we have lumped together in no chronology whatsoever what is known as the Pauline corpus, or the section of books written by the hand of the Apostle Paul. 13 books. So Paul wrote half of the New Testament. The reason that the book of Romans is the first book in this second section, Paul certainly did not write that first. As a matter of fact, in a few moments I'll give you the chronology of the writing of the New Testament books. It'll probably shock you. Romans was written probably later on his 3rd missionary journey. But the reason that book is first, and which introduces us to the whole Pauline world, is because Romans is Paul's masterpiece. It lays out for us the major doctrines of the Christian faith. We got a whole lesson on Romans. So you better bring your thinking cap that night, because it is heavy. And then, back in the back of the New Testament, we have a group of writings simply called the general epistles. By the way, you know what an epistle is? Let me tell you this. An epistle is not the wife of an apostle. I wanted to dispel that myth right off the bat. Okay? Epistle is simply the Greek word which means letter. Letter. So the general letters, and the reason they're called general letters is because they're not written to any specific recipient. Paul says, I, Paul, apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the believers in Thessalonica, or to the Christians at Rome, or to the Christians at Philippi. So there's a definite recipient. The general letters, which would include 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John and Jude and Revelation and James and Hebrews. Those letters were not written to any specific recipient, but rather were written to the church. So they were circulated, if you will. They were for all. So the New Testament is made up also of 3 sections. Matthew through Acts, the historical section, which is by and large chronological. Paul's letters, just lumped together, they're not chronological. And then the general letters back in the back of the New Testament, which take us to through the book of Revelation. Now, let me ask you this question. And those of you who have had disciple before, don't answer. But of the 27 books of the New Testament, which book do you suppose was written first? Now, I'm not talking about, if we talk about events, we would say Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, obviously. I'm not talking about the events that transpired, but as far as the first letter that was written, which book of the New Testament would you say was written first? Any guesses? Romans was written about 57 A.D., several years after the first letter was written.
That was a hint.
Well, and I'll give you another hint. It was written by Paul. And for the sake of time, I'll tell you what it is. It's the book of Galatians. Galatians. Let me give to you, we can't be 100% hard and fast about this, but this is pretty much a consensus of scholars as to the order of the books that were written. It's also interesting to note that the Old Testament was written over a period of about 1,200 years, a long span of time. The New Testament was written in between the years 48 A.D. and perhaps 100 A.D. Some even say earlier than 100, but let's say 100. 48 A.D. to 100 A.D. Much faster, much quicker. It happened much quicker. Why? Well, the Old Testament was the long, drawn-out process of the development of God's plan and purpose. The New Testament was, it's happened. It's here. Let's write about it. Hurry! So they wrote about it in a much shorter span of time. Let me give you the books. Here they are. Galatians, written in probably about 48 A.D. And the reason we know that that was probably written then was because Paul wrote that immediately following his first missionary journey. When we get to the book of Acts, we got 2 sessions on Acts. And the second session on Acts, we will detail all of Paul's 3 missionary journeys. I'll show you all where he went and where he wrote his letters from and all that kind of thing. But he wrote Galatians after he finished his first missionary journey, about 48 A.D. All right, here we go. Let me give you sort of in rapid-fire succession now the chronology of the writing of these books. The second book was probably the book of James. Did you know James and Jude, of course, were half-brothers of Jesus? Did you know that? Okay. Sons of Mary and Joseph after, of course, Jesus was born of Mary and, well, Mary was a virgin, of course, so Joseph was not his father. So they had the same mother. Then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Archaeology helps us to anchor some of these books, and right here is a good example. We know that 1st Thessalonians was written around 51 A.D., and there is a completely secular archaeological discovery that has been found. It's not biblical at all. It's secular archaeology, which has helped us to anchor the dating of this book. So 1st and 2nd Thessalonians about... James would probably have been written around 50 A.D. Then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And then 1st and 2nd Corinthians, written by Paul, probably around 54 A.D. Romans was next, around 57 A.D. Then you have the 4 short letters commonly called the prison epistles. We'll talk about those. But they are called prison epistles because Paul was in prison at Rome when he wrote them, during his first Roman imprisonment. We'll talk all about it. Those 4 letters are Ephesians, Colossians, that little letter Philemon. Some people call it Philemon. I think Philemon is more accurate. And then the book of Philippians. So Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians are known as the prison epistles. Paul wrote them while he was in prison at Rome. Probably around 60 A.D. And then, as we shall see, Paul was released from prison, and he wrote then the books of 1 Timothy. That's the next one he wrote. And then the next book he wrote was Titus. And the last book he wrote, and it's very obvious from the message and the mood of the letter, 2 Timothy. Right before he was probably beheaded during Nero's persecution, A.D. 65. A.D. 65. It's of general opinion probably that Peter also was probably martyred sometime during Nero's persecution, 66, 67, 68 A.D. Of course, you know Peter was crucified upside down. You know that. It doesn't say that in the Bible, but we have the history of the early church. And so 1st and 2nd Peter would probably be written next. somewhere around the same date, 66 AD, something like that. Now, we come to the writing of the Gospels. Interesting. Mark was probably written first, around 65 AD. And then Matthew, probably 70. And Luke, part 1 and part 2. You know, what's part 2 of Luke? The book of Acts. I threw you a screwball there, okay? Forgive me. Luke wrote the book of Acts as well, and if you'll read the first few verses of Luke and the first few verses of Acts, you'll see that they're meant to be Luke part 1 and part 2. Again, probably 70, 75-ish AD. Then that letter that's a bit obscure, Hebrews. Some say that Paul wrote Hebrews. Some say that Barnabas wrote Hebrews. Some say Apollos wrote Hebrews. We're not sure who wrote Hebrews. But it was probably written around, we're clumping a lot together here around 70 AD, but that's okay. Probably around 70 AD. And then the next letter to be written probably was that little bitty old letter back there in the back called Jude. Probably around 80 AD. And then finally, we have the epistles of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then somewhere probably right after that, John's Gospel. Probably around 90 AD. And finally, the book of Revelation, also written by John, around 100. Old. He was old. He was the youngest disciple. So John, John was well into his 80s, probably. They said, and this is even before he was banished to the Isle of Patmos, that when he would preach, he was kind of old and frail, and they would sort of bring a chair in. He would sit down in the chair, and his favorite message was, and you can read it in 1 John, my dear brothers, love one another, for love is of God. And he goes on about the love of God and how we are to love one another. So, give or take one or two, probably. That's probably a good chronology of the writing of the books of the New Testament. Now, I promised you something, didn't I? We're going to be talking a lot about different geographical places. We're going to be talking about the Sea of Galilee and Jerusalem and Bethlehem and the Jordan River and all of these places. And before we actually go to those places in the Gospels, I want to show you what these places look like. I had the privilege of going to Israel in January of 77 and then again in March of 93. And I can't begin to put in words, those of you who have been know what I'm saying. You can study the geography, you can study the Bible, you can study the events that took place and all, but when you finally go and make the pilgrimage, it's like it just pulls it all together.
It all comes alive.
It all comes alive, and then from then on, when you read these events in the Bible, you see them. You see them. So I wish we could just get a bus and go over there. Maybe someday we can. I'd love to, because there's nothing like it. But we can't do that tonight. So let's take a journey, and I want to show you some slides of the places in Israel, and I'll talk about them and try to describe them as we go along. And those of you who have been there, Keith, I know you have. Margie, you have. Has anybody else been over to the Holy Land? Chip in if I miss something. All right, hit him. That's my twin brother. That was, you mean on the camel? Yeah, they are hairy creatures. We are in Jerusalem. Right behind the hump is, well, you can see it over to the right. You can see the Dome of the Rock over there. But that is me in 1977. 10. for my age, wasn't I?
About 23.
How did you? I'm born in '54, so I guess I was. I was 22.
Were you preaching then?
I was in my last year of college, and then I was going on to seminary the next year. So I was studying for the ministry, but I was not in the ministry yet. So anyway, and as you can see, I haven't changed a bit. I don't know what's funny about that. But anyway, I tell you, those camels, did you ride a camel when you were over there? Anybody?
I did.
Whew, you got to be careful with those things. They get down on all fours,
They put you on one.
and you get on one, and
Charge you $1.
oh,
take
well,
you off.
that's what they do. And no, you get up on it, then they won't let you off until you give them $5 American. But when they get up back legs first.
Yeah, they do.
So if you're not hanging on, you will go off. Okay, this is not actually in Israel proper, but I want you to see this slide. This is of the Negev, the Negev, which would be between Israel and Egypt. And this would have been part of the territory where the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness for those 38 years. And I always questioned and wondered, how in the world can anybody get lost for 38 years in such a small geographical area until I visited the place. It is the most God-forsaken place I've ever seen in my life. And you can't tell what's north, south, east, west, up, or down. So I understood a little bit better how they could wander around in circles for a long time.
What, that's dirt?
That's just desert, sand, rock, dust. Yeah.
Going back and forth across there, you can see the rusted out tanks from the '67 war.
Oh, yeah.
Old battle scars.
How big of an area are we talking? In miles or?
Oh, my goodness. It's a lot, many square miles. I mean, it's the whole area. If you look on the map between the south of the Dead Sea, going down south, and then southwest all the way to Egypt. So it's
North and South Carolina? Or
I would say, yeah, that's probably a good analogy. North and South Carolina together, probably, yeah. Because the nation of Israel itself is of the size of New Jersey. Did you know that? That's how big Israel is, the size of New Jersey. Okay, now we begin our journey in the New Testament. In the foreground there, it's rather hilly as you can see. That would be the shepherd's fields, and in the background is Bethlehem. One of the things you will note when you go to Israel is the terrain is very hilly. And dotted all along this hillside are limestone caves such as this one right here. More than likely, Jesus was born in a cave, such as this, without the pillars, of course. Today, there is a church that stands on the spot where Jesus was born. And when you're over there, one of the things you hear, one of the phrases you hear over and again is, this is the traditional site where this took place. And pretty soon you come to realize what that means is, we're pretty close, but we're not sure that this is exactly the spot. But there are a couple of places where they're pretty sure that we're standing on the very spot, and this is one of them. This is the Church of the Nativity. This would have been the spot where Jesus was born. Another thing you have to get used to when you go over there is they have built these elaborate shrines and churches on top of these holy places. For some, that takes away, but you just sort of have to just kind of put that out of your mind and realize that even though there's this humongous church built over this site, you're standing on a very holy site. We stood there, and it was in January, and we sang together Silent Night and some Christmas songs. It was just a very, very special moment. In 323 A.D., Constantine sent his mother, Helena, to Palestine to try to discover three holy sites in Israel. And those holy sites were the place of Jesus' birth, the place of his death and resurrection, and the place of his ascension. Because of that then, Constantine had built these shrines over these three places. The Church of the Nativity was originally built by Constantine in the 4th century A.D. Of course, the building that stands there today is not that old. I think it goes back to around 1300 A.D. But when you walk into the church, into the sanctuary of the church, I remember there was a huge section of the floor cut out. And we walked up to the section and looked down about 10, 12 feet, and there was a beautiful mosaic tile floor 10, 12 feet below us. That floor actually went back to about 700 A.D. I mean, we went back many, many, many hundreds of years to the church that was probably built after Constantine's church. So it's really, really interesting history. But this is the place where the site where Jesus was born. One of the most beautiful sites in the Holy Land is the Jordan River. I think I've got a couple of pictures here. At times the Jordan River is fairly wide. At times it's very, very narrow. At times it's very, very shallow, and at times it's not really real deep, but it's kind of deep in some places. But what's interesting about the Jordan River is it travels from the south, from the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, all the way down to the Dead Sea, which is a journey of about 60 miles. But in traveling 60 miles, the Jordan River travels 150 miles. You know why? Because it doesn't travel in a straight line. It snakes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. There's a major fault line that runs right through this valley, the Jordan Valley, which is about 600 feet below sea level. But it's fresh water. And of course, the place where Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. We're now in the city of Jericho. Jericho's to my back. There in the distance you see a mountain, and you can't really see it there on the screen, but about halfway up the mountain there is a Byzantine monastery which was built around 1200 A.D. And that mountain is known as the Mount of Temptation, commemorating the area where Jesus was during his 40 days, 40 nights of temptation. So they built a Byzantine monastery to commemorate that event in the life of Christ. Now if I do an about face and turn directly around, there's what you see. It's the city of Jericho, which is literally an oasis in the middle of the desert. Oranges, I think the thickest skinned oranges I've ever seen in my life. By the way, the three major industries in Israel: oranges, diamonds, and tourism. Diamonds. Now, picture this in your mind. Jerusalem is 2,455 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea is the lowest place on the face of the earth. It's 1,300 feet below sea level, and they're only 20 miles apart. So many times we read about Jesus traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jericho's down at the base of the Dead Sea, or the Dead Sea level. So the road from Jerusalem to Jericho is traveling 20 miles, and you're going from 2,500 feet above sea level to 1,300 feet below sea level. So that tells you how steep that road is. So as we were on our way from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea, there's the sea level marker. Another picture of Jericho. Jericho is the oldest city in the world. Now what you're looking at here is part of modern day Jericho. Old Neolithic Jericho goes back. They found city walls that date back to 8,000 BC. This is the Dead Sea. 50 miles long, 10 miles wide. Nothing lives in the Dead Sea. And I'll tell you why. The ocean is 3% salt. The Dead Sea is 33% salt.
We jumped in our bathing suits.
Yes.
We just floated right there, just laid out on the water.
Oh, you can sit up and read the newspaper.
That's right. That's pretty wild.
Unbelievable. You float like a cork. But it's very toxic. Very toxic. I didn't actually get in, but I remember sticking my hand in there, and when I pulled my hand out, it felt like I had poured 3-in-1 oil on my hand. I said, man, I got to wash my hand. But
I have a Coke bottle full of water right on it.
you what, Margie?
I drank a Coke while we were there, and I filled the bottle with water out of the Dead Sea.
Yes.
And put the cap back on and brought it home. I still have it.
You still have it?
78.
So if anybody wants to be baptized in Dead Sea water, she's got some.
I do.
Your hair might fall out, but you'll be baptized.
I still.
Well, what's Salt Lake? What's the percentage of salt in Salt Lake?
Salt Lake?
Uh-huh.
Don't know that, but I imagine it would be on up there, be more than 3%.
Is there a reason for salt?
It's the minerals. The minerals in that area that come off of the rocks, and it's incredible. And they can use those minerals for good purposes. But just all the minerals that feed into the water from the land. But again, remember this. The water in the Sea of Galilee is fresh water. The water in the Sea of Galilee flows south down through the Jordan River, which is fresh water. And so it's fresh water that pours into the Dead Sea. But there is no outlet for the Dead Sea. So the water comes into the Dead Sea, it gathers those minerals, it stagnates, if you will, and it just stops. It has no flow. Now there's a sermon in there. There's a sermon in the Dead Sea. And that is, as long as God's love is flowing through us, we're going to be fresh in our faith. But if we ever stop becoming a conduit and become a reservoir of God's love and just let it stay right here and we try to hoard it and keep it and we don't share it, we'll become like the Dead Sea. And by the way, the Dead Sea stinks. So you don't want to stink.
And aren't those mountains?
They are
Back
mountains.
around Jordan?
Uh-huh, yes.
Go through Jordan.
Yes, I have some other. It's really very beautiful. The Dead Sea, at its deepest point, is 1,300 feet deep. That's the northern part of the Dead Sea. Now, the Dead Sea is definitely divided into two sections, north and south. And what's interesting is the southern end of the Dead Sea, at its deepest point, is only 40 feet deep. Now, what that tells people who are experts in that area is that at one time, the southern end of the Dead Sea was dry land. A lot of scholars believe that the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah we read about in Genesis 19 used to be at the southern end of the Dead Sea. And whatever happened to them, we read about fire and brimstone. Something happened, probably some type of seismic activity, earthquake and that kind of thing, which caused the land to shift. And actually the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, if that be true, then sort of settled down and the waters of the Dead Sea just covered them right up. So a lot of scholars believe that Sodom and Gomorrah, what was Sodom and Gomorrah, is now under the water of the southern end of the Dead Sea. Now the Dead Sea is directly to my back, and so I'm making about face, and there is cave number 4. Of the Qumran community. By the way, Qumran is Q-U-M-R-A-N, Qumran. This is where the Essenes, remember we talked about that group, who were largely responsible for writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. They lived in a monastic community in this area, and this is one of the caves where archaeologists found a lot of scrolls of the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Essenes had hidden there in 68 AD. When they heard that the Romans were coming from Jerusalem down to Masada to destroy them, they hid the scrolls in caves because they were scrolls of many of the Old Testament books. And so they were sacred, so they hid those scrolls. So in 1947, when that little boy was throwing rocks out in the desert, and he threw a rock in one of these caves, and it hit something, and it made a sound, when he went up there, he discovered what came to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is cave number 4, where they found several scrolls. And I'll tell you what, I'll bet you what we've not found is greater than what we have found, hidden out there in the Judean hills. We're riding along the shores of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is to my back. And in the distance there is a plateau that rises some 800 feet. You know what the name of that plateau is? Masada. That is Masada. They have, we rode a cable car. It looks like a Swiss cable car, a gondola. We rode that up to the top. In 1977, we rode to the top and we walked down. There is what they call a snake path. I may have a, well, as you can see, there are steps going up once you get up to the top. We walked down the snake path. When we went over in 93, we rode the gondola up and rode the gondola down. And that's the way to go, right, Margie? Did you go to Masada? You walked down? Whoa.
Not this
Did you go?
time, but down the snake path.
Did you? It's not too bad.
No, it wasn't.
What
I
about-
was younger then.
Did you go up? Did you go to Masada?
I had some good things.
From the top of Masada, spectacular views of the Dead Sea. And what you cannot see here, but you can, there are certain places from the top of Masada you can look down and you can still see the remains of the Roman camps. That in 70 A.D., that's where they camped as for 3 years as they were building the ramp up to the top of Masada. Up until 4 B.C., Masada was Herod the Great's winter palace. I think I have some pictures. There we go. This is the remains of the temple or the synagogue that Herod had built while he was up there. In 4 B.C., when Herod the Great died, the Romans took it over as a fortress. Makes sense. And then in 66 or 70 A.D., a group of fanatical Pharisees, revolutionaries called zealots, overthrew, how they did it I don't know, they overthrew the Roman garrison and they took Masada, took control of Masada. And in 70 A.D., after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, the Romans came on down to Masada, and they, for 3 years, they built a ramp up to the top of Masada, and in 3 years, they made it to the top and broke through, but they found 960 dead people. The zealots said we'd rather die by our own hands than to die by the hands of the Romans. Look at that beautiful mosaic floor. That's up on Masada. Not sure if that's during Herod's time or perhaps Roman times. But they had bathhouses. They were, I tell you, the Romans, that's one of the things I came away with, one of the many things I came away with from my trip was an appreciation for the Romans. They were ingenious people to build aqueducts for miles and miles and miles. They had saunas and spas on the top of Masada. Steam, where you could take a steam bath. It's just amazing. Another view from the top. Of course, as we said, the modern Israeli army, once they go through their training, the last thing that happens as they're sworn in, they're taken to Masada. And they take the oath that Masada will never fall again. That man was my pastor in 1977, and I went with him. And you can see we're looking down from Masada. We're now on the coast at a city known as Caesarea, named after Augustus Caesar, by Herod the Great, Caesarea or Caesarea. Caesarea was the administrative capital. It was the headquarters of the Holy Land of Israel. So anytime that some dignitary from Rome came, he would always stay here at Caesarea. And this is looking out there over the Mediterranean Sea. That is both ancient ruins and modern building. We're now standing in Samaria. We took a drink of water from a well there, known as Jacob's Well. And this is where Jesus met with the woman who asked him one day, how can you even ask me for a drink of water? You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan, and you Jews don't have anything to do with us Samaritans. And Jesus said, well, if you knew who I was, if you knew who I am, you could ask of me and I would give you living water. Of course, this is the site of John chapter 4. And then in the course of the conversation, the lady said to Jesus, you Jews say that Jerusalem, the mountain in Jerusalem, is the place you should worship. But we've always been taught here that this mountain is where we are to worship. Which one is right? And Jesus basically said neither one. But the time is coming when people will worship the Lord in spirit and in truth. It's not so much where you are, it's where is your heart, the state of your heart. This mountain is Mount Gerizim. That would have been the mountain that was holy to the Samaritans. The mountain the woman was referring to when she said, we're told that we're to worship on this mountain. And of course, if you look down, you can see some laundry hanging out on the line. That probably was not there when Jesus was there. This is quite a place. We've gone north now, and we're in a valley, and we're in a little place called Megiddo. This place, Megiddo, has another name. In Hebrew, it's often called Har Megiddo, which means the mountain of Megiddo. And from Har Megiddo, we get the word Armageddon. This is the valley of Armageddon. Some of the most fertile soil in the world. Topsoil goes down farther than topsoil is supposed to. Many, many battles have been fought in this valley. Of course, in the book of Revelation, it talks about the battle of Armageddon. There were two places that meant the most to me when I took my trip, and this is one of them. This is the Sea of Galilee. And as one person said, the reason this meant most to me is because they could not build a shrine over the Sea of Galilee. It was just too big. 12 miles long, 6 miles wide. 150 feet deep at its deepest point. Fresh water. About 630 feet below sea level. So what happens is the cool air comes down the mountainside and mixes with the warm air rising off of the water, and you can have unpredictable and sudden storms and squalls. I mean, they can come up just like that. And so when we read in the scriptures, that's what happened. The disciples were out on the lake, and suddenly a storm arises. Master, we're going to die! Jesus says, be still. Storm, shut up. And literally, that's what Jesus said, by the way. We read this, peace, be still. Jesus literally looked at the clouds and says, be still. And the disciples then said, who is this? That even the winds and the waves obey his voice. This place is on a hill next to the Sea of Galilee, and it's supposedly the place where Jesus taught his Sermon on the Mount. Again, a little shrine, a little church commemorating that place. We boarded this yacht, That was meant to be funny. And we set sail, not sail, we went from Capernaum, which is at 12 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee, down to Capernaum, which is at 9 o'clock. A lot of you remember Bud Streetman. Remember Bud? In 93, March of 93, when we went, Bud and Marianne were along. And we were, you can imagine Bud, out on the Sea of Galilee in a boat. And he was just blubbering. He was just, you know, he would cry. He was getting so blessed. And finally some of us said, well, Bud, why don't you step out and see if you can walk on water? You remember? You remember Jesus told Peter to do it. Well, Bud was about to do it. So we had to stop him. You can imagine. Place where Jesus walked on the water. Place where the disciples fished. Place where Jesus said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. Beautiful, beautiful place. I mean, when you walk around the shore of the Sea of Galilee, you know you're walking in the very steps where Jesus and the disciples walked.
Jesus delivers several messages standing in the water so the crowds couldn't come out any further.
Yes, standing in the water, standing out in the boat. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
He could speak. It was like a perfect amphitheater.
That's right.
He could speak for hundreds of yards. You could hear one voice.
Now what you're seeing, there was a guy on the boat who had a zoom lens, and I asked him if I could borrow it, and I put his zoom lens on my Minolta, and I took a picture of this. That in the distance is Mount Hermon. That's actually up in Lebanon. But that's about 9,000 feet in altitude, and as you can see, it's snow-capped. So our guide said we were very, very blessed to be able, for all the elements to be right for us to be able to see Mount Hermon from the Sea of Galilee. Now we sort of come home. We're standing on a little hill called Mount Scopus, and we're looking toward Jerusalem. Very hilly, but you can see in the very center there the Dome of the Rock. Another picture. Over to the right is modern Jerusalem. And of course, the old city of Jerusalem is there within the city walls. It's amazing to walk through the old city of Jerusalem. I mean, you literally go back in time. It's unreal. There in the heart of Jerusalem is the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, as it's called in Arabic. And there at the top is what is called the Dome of the Rock. Originally built around 700 A.D. by one of Muhammad's generals, Caliph Omar and his crowd. It has been destroyed through the years and rebuilt. It was destroyed around 1000 A.D. and rebuilt. I think damaged in an earthquake sometime later and rebuilt. The structure that's there today, I think, goes back to 1400 A.D. It is the third most holy site to Islam, Mecca being first, Medina being second, and Jerusalem being third. There are 4 quarters to Jerusalem, by the way, 4 sections. There's your Christian section, your Jewish section, your Muslim section, and your Armenian section. The nation of Armenia in Turkey was the first nation that declared themselves as a nation to be Christian around 300 A.D. If you go in this building, you have to take off your shoes, and what's in the center of this building is a huge rock. Not huge in that it's tall, it's not more than 3 or 4 or 5 feet tall, but it's huge, its width is huge. And that is the rock where Abraham was going to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And so to the religion of Islam, of course, they go back to that event in their religion. And that's a holy moment for them Of course, they add a lot of other things that they say transpired in the life of Muhammad. But this is built over that site. Now, what's interesting is Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple, which was built around 960 BC, was built on this very site. It was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. It was rebuilt again in 515 BC, known as the Second Temple. It was destroyed finally in 70 AD by the Romans. And around 696 AD, during the Islamic Revolution, they took control of this area and they built a shrine over there.
Are there markers over there to tell you all of this, Gary, that when you're walking around looking at this?
No.
How did you know all that you just told us?
Well, all my reading and studying and
Your guide?
guides. Oh yeah, now that's true. The guides will tell you a lot of this. Now here's something that's interesting, and just for you to ponder. I don't know, but in the scriptures and in theology, there's the idea that one day the Jews will rebuild the temple. And by the way, that is their desire. You know that, to rebuild the temple. But there's one problem, and you're looking at it. That's where the Jewish temple is supposed to be.
Well, something will happen to that.
Well, that's where you're right, Ruth. The question is, I mean, can you imagine if the Jews would try to blow that up? I mean, the political ramifications of that. But as I said, what's interesting is there have been many earthquakes through this area. Many, many earthquakes. Could it be? I do not know. This is just conjecture.
Several years ago that they already have shipped the stone from the United States over there to build it.
I've heard that too. I've heard things like that. But could it be that one day an earthquake of 6 or 7 or 8 on the Richter scale will take place and bring this edifice down, which will pave the way for the Jews to once again rebuild their temple? I don't know. That's just pure speculation. But it's interesting all the politics of this. That here's an Islamic shrine built on the place where Solomon's temple was built. Beautiful, ornate, as you can see. It's really a beautiful building. We're looking down from the city of Jerusalem down to the Kidron Valley, and you see that little shrine right in the middle? That was built on the traditional site where Jesus stood and wept. And the roof, if you will, that is supposed to kind of have a drooping shape, like a drooping teardrop. But that's the place where Jesus cried and prayed and said, "O Jerusalem, how I would have gathered you as a hen does her chicks, but you wouldn't let me." This is the Wailing Wall. This is all that's left from the temple that where Jesus was in his time. I would say the two bottom rows of stones, maybe 3, but I would say at least 2. That's all that was left after the Romans came in and destroyed it. It has subsequently been built up, but the bottom 2 rows of stones are the only thing left from the temple, from the holy temple. This is the wall that would go around the courtyard, not the wall of the building of the temple. So this is the only thing the Jews have that they can actually touch that takes them back to their roots. So every Sabbath day and on holy days, a mass of Jewish people will gather. You see the fence over to the right. The males are on one side, the females on the other side. You have to have something on your head. And so the Jewish people, then the Pharisees, will gather there, and they will stand before the Wailing Wall, and they will read their Torah, and they will mutter. They will mutter prayers under their breath. And when you get several thousand people praying, muttering under their breath, it sounds like one big wail. a moan, one prayer. That's the reason it's called the Wailing Wall.
Rock back and forth.
They rock back and forth. That's right. And,
Little tiny messages.
that's right. They write little prayers on pieces of paper, fold it up and stick it in the cracks and the crevices. They're just filled with pieces of paper. There's another, all that's left from the temple that was destroyed in 70 A.D.
Did you go inside? I think there's a place you can go in, or the men can go inside. Women aren't allowed to. Probably down at this end.
Okay. They're doing archaeological excavation if you go to your left. We did go in there, and what was interesting, they had done some excavation, and we looked down about 10 or 15 feet, and underneath those stones, those 2 rows of stone, the bottom 2 rows of stones, you could see down to rows of stones that went down 10, 15 feet. Those stones actually go back to Solomon's temple.
I don't think any of our group went, but I knew that people were able, the men were able to go.
Oh, yeah. This, remember I said that the Sea of Galilee was one of the places that meant the most to me? This is the other place. This is the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane means, in the Hebrew tongue, olive press. And it's filled with olive trees. And I was amazed at how old some of those olive trees are. I'm going to show you one in just a moment on the picture here that the guide said could have been there when Jesus prayed. It's that old. And still producing olives, by the way. That may be it right there. That is at least 1,500, if not 2,000 years old. Of course, it was there where Jesus prayed the last night. It was there where he was arrested as Judas came and kissed him and betrayed him. And this is just across the valley. If you come down the hill from Jerusalem across what is called the Kidron Valley, you are at this place called Gethsemane. Now we are at the place that is called Golgotha, the place of the skull, Mount Calvary. If you look in the side of the hill there, you can sort of, with a little bit of imagination, make out what looks like 2 eyes of a skull and a nose. There's a cemetery up there today, as you can see. And this is right next to a bus line. I mean, it's hustle and bustle. I mean, and of course, when Jesus was crucified, it wasn't out in the woods somewhere. It was where people walked by. It was during a major foot thoroughfare, if you will, where people could come by and mock and make fun of them. And so, and then just around the corner is a place called Gordon's Calvary, discovered in 1883 by Colonel Charles Gordon, a British colonel. And he said that if this is not the place where Jesus resurrected, this most assuredly resembles what it probably looked like. It's just around the corner from Mount Calvary, so it could very well be the place. But we can't be certain that this is actually the place. Now, to give you the whole story, if in Jerusalem is not too far from this, is called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You remember I told you there were 3 places that Constantine built. The Church of the Nativity, over where Jesus was born. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, over which Jesus was crucified and he arose. And the Church of the Ascension. There's a chapel built over the place on the Mount of Olives where Jesus supposedly arose from that point. But in Jerusalem is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is Roman Catholic. And if you go in, they'll show you the place where they believe Jesus was crucified and the place they believe where he was buried and from which he arose. You could get into debates. Well, is that place right? Is this place right? Well, again, I say they're very, very close in proximity, so regardless of who's right or who's wrong, you're standing in the area But if I were a betting man, which I don't do that, I'm not saying it's wrong, but I'm just saying I don't do that, I would probably say the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is probably more accurate. Because historically we know that that was built originally in the 4th century A.D. So there's a lot of history that goes back to that church that was built over that place. And at that time when Helena, Constantine's mother, came back to discover these sites, it still would have been pretty popularly known where these places were. So probably the Church of the Holy Sepulchre actually does stand over the site where Jesus was crucified and where he arose. But this place probably reminds you of what it really looked like. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is kind of musty and it's dark, and you can't really get a feel of what it looked like in the time. But here you can. And by the way, I went in this tomb, and I can attest it is empty. I don't know why I've got this picture in there. In 77, we took a 2-day excursion down to Eilat, E-I-L-A-T, which is down on the Gulf of Aqaba. And Solomon, I think, had some places here. But it's really a modern resort. The water is beautiful, and it has a kind of a Caribbean feel to it. Did you go there? Anybody go there?
Yeah, that's a great place for
Oh, you went there too? Okay.
college boys to hang out with the European women. That was great.
Lonnie, you might want to erase that statement. All right.
It's great, great place.
Mike, would you hit those lights for me? Okay, any questions or?
Place looks timeless.
It is. It's a good way of putting it.
I was traveling with a Jewish guy who was staying with all of his Jewish relatives, and we walked down the way of the cross. What do you call it?
The Via Dolorosa.
The Via Dolorosa. And me being an illiterate Bible person, I was like, oh, that's cool. This is cool. Okay, let's go on next. What do you want to do for lunch? He's like, this didn't even, just went right over your head.
Oh, yeah.
What we were seeing and the significance of where we were.
Oh, yeah. In Jerusalem, they do have, Keith mentioned the Way of the Cross, the 7 stations of the cross. But another place that meant a lot to me was we actually went down underneath the modern day Jerusalem. And there's a place there called the Gabbatha. And that's actually the courtyard where Jesus would have been held before Pilate and all those guys. And the stones are old. And that's the actual pavement where Jesus was. So, I mean, when you walk there, you're walking where Jesus was standing before Pilate. And what was interesting, on one of the stones, and the stones were about this big square, was the carving. Did you see this? A carving. The Romans had carved a circle in this stone, and they played a game called the Game of the Kings. Did you see that?
I did, and that was the only place that we went that it really touched Eddie to the point of crying.
Because they would play, this is where the Roman soldiers would play games to see who lives and who dies. So it makes sense, doesn't it? That's the place where Jesus stood before Pilate and before Caiaphas and all these guys. And they decided to release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. You can't go over there and come back the same person. You just can't do it. But if you don't ever have a chance to go over there, I don't think you can ever ponder this story and ever be the same. Okay, any questions?
How long were you there in 77?
Actually over there, I think 8 days, and of course you have your days travel to and from, but I think about 8 days in 77 because we took a 2-day excursion or a day and a half excursion to Eilat. So, yeah.
Jerry, your second trip, was it the same trip?
It was. We did not go to Eilat. We saw some things. The guide we had in 93 was Palestinian, and he had a home over there, and just a great guy. And he took us to places where most tours do not get to go. One of the places he took us was to the Valley of the Shadow of Death. It's an actual place. And it's on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and it's a point where the road goes down, and there's cavern-like walls on either side. And it's a very dangerous place. Dangerous for several reasons. The sheep could get hurt. It's places where thieves and robbers would hide to accost the shepherds and steal from them. It's a place where wolves or wild animals could hide. So the sheep were afraid to go. It's a very shadowy place. And so when they got to that point, the sheep wouldn't go any farther until the shepherd got out in front of them. And the sheep saw the shepherd going first. And then because they trusted their shepherd, they would follow. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death in life, I will not fear. How? I know you are with me. So David was pondering all of that, and then he applied the sheep's relationship to the shepherd, of which David was a shepherd, to our relationship to our great shepherd, and wrote the greatest psalm I think that's ever been written. Okay, it's almost 18 minutes after 8 o'clock. We've gone over a little bit. Let's take a break for about 10 minutes, and when we come back, there's one more thing I want to do with you tonight, and that is I want us to look at the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. They're different. Why? We'll look at that after break.
This is the end of the first half. The remainder of Disciple 1, Lesson 18, can be found on CD 2 of this set. This is CD 2. Following is the second half of Disciple 1, Lesson 18.
Okay, in our time left, what I want to do is talk about, we're spending 6 weeks on the gospel, so we want to talk about some of the unique features. One of the unique features of Matthew and Luke is the genealogy of Jesus. Mark says nothing about it. John says nothing about it. And the genealogy is found in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. Turn to those two chapters, and let's talk about that just for a moment. Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. Now, Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus from Abraham forward to Christ, supposedly through Joseph. Luke traces the genealogy of Jesus from Jesus back all the way to Adam. So as you see, as I drew the chart here, from Adam to Abraham, Luke does that. Matthew says nothing about what the genealogy between Adam and Abraham. He picks up at Abraham. Now, when you look at the two genealogies, here's the issue. Both genealogies appear to trace Jesus' genealogy back through Joseph. That's Joseph and Mary, okay? Now, the problem is this. Of course, first of all, you ask the question, why? If Joseph was not really the father of Jesus, then why do they need to trace Joseph's genealogy? Well, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But there's another problem, more apparent, and that is, if both genealogies trace the genealogy of Jesus through Joseph, Matthew, look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 16. And it says that Jacob is the father of Joseph. Now put your finger there and turn over to Luke chapter 3. Keep your finger in Matthew 1 and Luke 3 for the next little bit. And if you look at Luke chapter 3, verse 23, the last part of that verse, it reads that he, Jesus, was the son, so it was thought of Joseph, the son of Heli. So Luke says that Joseph's father was Heli. Matthew says Joseph's father was Jacob. Now, I'm not an expert in genealogies and in biological succession, but I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to know that you can't have two biological fathers. So what's wrong here? Is there an obvious discrepancy? Is the Bible just plainly wrong here? Well, if the Bible's wrong, as a lot of skeptics want to tell us, say to us, well, if the Bible's wrong, then you can't trust it. Then that really erodes this thing called the inspiration. How can God inspire something that's wrong? So is there a discrepancy, or Is there a key to understanding this that unlocks it? And I believe there is. That's what I want to share with you for the next moment. First of all, I want you to look at the contextual evidence. Both Matthew and Luke both go out of their way to let us know that Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus. Have you noticed that? Get your highlighters ready. If you haven't, I want to show you this. Look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 16 again. And if you'll look at the pattern that precedes that, the first 15 verses, it's always so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, and so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, and so-and-so begat so-and-so. It's always the man, the man, the man. When he gets to verse 16 of chapter 1, notice how he reads that, how he writes that. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom. Now notice whom now goes back to Mary. Suddenly the spotlight is off of Joseph and it's on to Mary. Jacob was the father of Joseph. Joseph was the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus. So Matthew deliberately breaks this pattern of the father begets the father and the father begets the father. And clearly there is telling us that Jesus was born of Mary, not of Joseph. Still the question looms. Then why in the world, if Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus, why did you go to such details in laying out the genealogy of Joseph? We're going to come back to that in just a moment. Put your finger in Matthew 1 and look at Luke chapter 3. Notice how Luke puts it. Verse 23. Now Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son, notice the next four words, so it was thought, of Joseph. So even Luke here puts his own little addendum in there to say to us, people think Joseph is the father of Jesus, but he's not. Again, the question is, why would Luke say that and then turn around and lay out for us in great detail the genealogy of Joseph? And if they're both the genealogy of Joseph, why are they different? Now, let me show you something. From Abraham to David, the genealogies laid out in Matthew and Luke are identical. Person for person for person. You can go right down the line and they jive. Is that still a good word in the jive? It's not? They are identical. All right. Okay, you get me. From Abraham to David, both in Matthew and Luke, they are identical. But when you get to David, they branch off. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Look at Matthew chapter 1, verse number 6. David, or Jesse the father of David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Solomon, the father of Rehoboam. Now notice something. So Matthew traces the line through David, through Solomon. Now, put your finger there and turn over to Luke, chapter 3. Now, Luke writes it backwards. So look at chapter 3, verse 31. The last part of that verse. See where it says, the son of Nathan, the son of David. Luke traces the genealogy through David, but not Solomon, David's other son, Nathan. Aha, there's the fork. But why? We could spend a lot of time talking about this. But let me cut through the chase. That still works, doesn't it? Cut through the chase. Thank you. And here's what I think is happening here. I think that Matthew is tracing for us the genealogy of Jesus through David, through Solomon, and ultimately Joseph. Joseph was of the line of Solomon. Mary was not of the line of Solomon, but she was of David. through Nathan.
So they were cousins many times removed.
Many times removed is the operative phrase. Now, here's what I think. I believe, look at Luke with me now. Now, Luke, just a moment, chapter 3. Here's where we stretch a little bit. I'm going to admit this. We're going to stretch just a little bit. But I believe this is what is happening. See, I believe Matthew is tracing Jesus' genealogy through Joseph. Luke is tracing Jesus' genealogy through Mary. That's the reason for the discrepancy, which would mean then, here in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, when it says that Jesus was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph, the son of Heli, what that actually reads is, or what it can mean is, that Joseph was the son-in-law of Heli. There's obviously a break there. They cannot be tracing the same genealogies. They're two different people. But yet the key is both people go back to David. Remember, one of the qualifications to be Messiah was Abraham. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. The promise to him was, through you, Abraham, all peoples of the world shall be blessed. The Messianic line is going to run through Abraham, and then, as you said, it's going to run through David. The Messiah is going to be a son or an offspring of David. So they both converge in David, but they split from David. And so here's what I think is happening then. See, the reason Matthew was tracing Joseph's line, even though Jesus was not of Joseph, was this. You got to think like a Jew. To the Jewish mindset, though Joseph was not Jesus' biological father, he was his legal father. And to a Jew, the way they think is, if someone is a legal father of a child, that father is just as much a father as a biological father, in the mind of the Jews. Now, what is another qualification to be Messiah? He was going to be a king. In other words, he's going to be of kingly stock. Mary is not of kingly stock. She is of David through Nathan. So how can Jesus fulfill the qualification to be king? Well, he comes through Joseph, who was his legal father. Jesus is now of Solomon, which is the kingly line. Solomon represents the kingly line. Okay? The kingly line. Now get this now, just follow me. Legally then, in the mind of the Jewish people, because Joseph was Jesus' legal father, many believed he was his biological father, legally then Jesus was of royal stock, kingly stock. Therefore, in the mind of a Jew, yes, this guy could be Messiah because he is of the kingly line. So, what's happening here is, and I'm going to make it not a solid line, but a line like this, because Jesus was not biologically of Joseph, but because Joseph was his legal father, and he came through Solomon, Jesus fulfills that qualification to be Messiah because he is of kingly stock. Now, Luke, though, there's another, but if we stop right there, we'd have a problem. Because even though legally Jesus has the right, he is of kingly stock, if he's going to be Messiah, he's got to actually be of the bloodline of David biologically. Well, we know where that comes in. Luke traces Mary's genealogy, not through Solomon, but through Nathan, so that biologically, Jesus literally is the son of David. Okay, and legally, he had the right to be king or to be of kingly stock. So here's what's happening. The genealogies do branch here, but they come back and they converge from two different angles, two different very necessary angles in order for Jesus to truly be the promised Messiah of the Old Testament who was going to be of the house and the lineage of David. From David, he literally is of the bloodline of David through Nathan. Through David and Solomon, Joseph was legally his father. He has the right to rule and to be king. So therefore, both the royal line and the kingly line come together in the person of Jesus Christ. That's what Matthew and Luke are tracing and showing that he fulfills both qualifications to be Messiah. He's of David, and he is truly of royal stock. So, there's not a discrepancy there. They're not contradictory. They're complementary. And they just branch here at David, but they come back together in Jesus. Had you ever seen that difference before, that discrepancy? Well, now you have. And now you know what I believe that means. Because the Messiah was to be a king, and he was to be of the line of David. And Matthew and Luke show how that's possible through his heritage. Keith.
And Matthew purposely did that because he's writing to the Jews to try to prove to the Jews that this is the fulfillment of it.
Thank you. Very important. The gospel writers were writing to different recipients. Matthew's recipients clearly are Jewish people. Because read, all through Matthew, he constantly ties it back to the Old Testament. This happened so that it might be fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah when he said. This was fulfilled so that what might be spoken by the prophet Jeremiah might be fulfilled. Constantly tying it back to the Old Testament. That was important to a Jewish person. So it would have been important to a Jewish person to see that Jesus is of this kingly stock through David. Luke wrote to the Greeks. And so therefore he traces him back all the way to Adam to show that, hey, he's a human being. He wasn't just divine, he's human. And he came the bloodline through Mary. He's of the house of David through the birth from Mary's womb. He's one of us. He's a human being. Mark wrote to the Romans. You don't read much in Mark about tying it back to the Old Testament. Romans didn't care much about that. John wrote to everybody. Whosoever will, listen to me. So you're right. Thank you, Keith. Different recipients, and that's why that would have been important, because Matthew would try to prove, if you will, to the Jewish people that Jesus has the stock and the lineage to be Messiah. Good stuff. Good stuff. Okay. Any further questions, comments? Next week, we're going to be in Matthew 2. I think you have to read Matthew again. And let me tell you another thing I'm going to do next week. I do this with trepidation, but I do it every year. Not only are we going to talk about the unpardonable sin, but I'm going to tackle what I think to be one of the most difficult verses in the New Testament. It's in the Sermon on the Mount, and it's that verse where Jesus talks about divorce and adultery. You know which one I'm talking about? That's tough. But there's a key to unlock it. You got to come next week to get the key. Where we're going to talk about it. Okay? Questions, comments? All right. Let's pray together. Lord, you have given us a coffer full of treasures and mysteries. And we don't understand them all, and we'll never understand and unlock all the mysteries in this lifetime. But Lord, you have given us enough to understand that's going to make an eternal difference in our lives. And that is that you so loved the world. Oh, we come back to that, don't we? You so loved the world that you initiated and formulated and developed and finished this plan for us. And then this little baby was born, both of royal and kingly stock, born in a manger for us, who would grow up and be the King of the Jews, but more than that, would be our King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so tonight, Lord, as we worship you and as we leave this place, we pray your presence and spirit will go with us. That what we've learned here tonight, Lord, will enrich us as we go out tomorrow into the world. That you will keep us, you will hold us. That you will forgive us, Lord, when we mess up. And we do and we will. But you're always there to pick us up. And so, Lord, we thank you and we worship you tonight for this time we've had together to learn. And Lord, any time that we unlock some of these mysteries, we just have to stop and say thank you. Thank you for what you've done for us. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you.